I'm going to, if you've got anyone who's watching live, if you've got any specific questions about what I mean by slash and spread, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to move on and I'm going to start talking about slashing and spreading. So I'm going to use a sleeve as an example. And the sleeve is a really basic pattern shape. So you've probably all seen one of these if you've made your own clothes. And there's lots of stuff I can do with this sleeve to turn it into something else. And the method that I'm going to use is my friend slash and spread or cut and spread. There are essentially two different ways of transforming a pattern into a new pattern style. So I have always cut things up, moved them apart, made them into a new shape. Some pattern cutters use what's called pivot and slide, and I will going to do another little session on pivot and slide another time. But since this is my favoured method, I thought I would start with my old friend, slash and spread. Okay, so I've got a basic sleeve and I've decided that I want to create something a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to, let's say I'm going to turn this into a gathered sleeve head. So when I'm slashing and spreading, there are two different basic principles. So the first one is that I'm only going to add wedges of volume, and so one edge is going to stay the same as the original pattern. And then the second version of slashing and spreading is that you divide all the pieces and spread them apart, either evenly or unevenly, so you change the circumference of the top and the bottom of your pattern piece. So I'm going to show you, if you look at the sleeve that I'm wearing, can you see that it's fitted around the head? So around here it fits me, but at the hem it's got a little bit of extra volume that's been gathered up into a band. So I'm going to show you first up exactly how to make this kind of sleeve with your basic sleeve pattern. All right, so we've got our sleeve, and then I need to mark some slash lines. So I will often use the grain line to get started, and just make sure that you've got some notches, because we want to make sure that everything ends up still fitting into our armhole. So I'm going to put one line there. And then with slashing and spreading, it depends on how smooth you want the changed line to be. So if you only put a few lines in, you end up with a slightly jaggedy edge. If you put more lines in, you'll end up with a smoother edge. So I could do this, I'm going to just do 3 here. So I could do a couple, or I could do a minimal amount. So this is just something for you guys to play with. And then taking my paper scissors, I'm going to cut along this slash line or cut line. Sometimes you'll see this referred to in pattern making books as cut and spread. And then slash through this one. And can you see that right at the top, I've left a tiny little hinge. So I'm going to talk to you about what happens when you use a sewing pattern for this, but I'll just get going with the demo. And now I find it helpful to have a sort of quilting mat underneath, because then I've got nice straight lines that I can use. So I'm going to line up my grain line with a straight line. And I'm just going to put a tiny little bit of tape just to anchor that up there. And then going to spread this an even distance apart. So think about how much extra width that you want to add at your cuff if you're doing like a bishop sleeve like mine. Well, mine's not quite a bishop sleeve, but say a gathered sleeve. So I've added an extra centimetre. I could add an extra 2 centimetres. So I've kept that line in the middle, and then I'm spreading that evenly apart. So I'm going to stick with the centimetre, and then you can just use a bit of tape to stick this to your board. And then in this example, because I've only got 2 slashes, I would then create the same kind of spread here. So I would never do it with multiple on one side and only one on the other. I just wanted to show you the difference in the shape. But when I've got more slash lines, I can make a smoother spread. So I might want to put in, say, 2 centimetres there and anchor that to your board, and then another 2 centimetres there. So you've got an idea of how much extra you want to add, because before I would have started, I would have measured the circumference of my existing sleeve and decided that maybe I want it to be twice that circumference, and so that will tell me how many centimetres I'm adding in. All right, so that's basically our sleeve, our new sleeve shape. So it's still going to fit you around the armhole because you haven't changed this circumference, but you've now got a different style in your sleeve. So this is why it's the basis of pattern making, and it's great for pattern hacking. So let me see. I'm just going to come back and chat to you on camera. So you guys, oops. All right, so we have a little bit of comedy has just happened with my camera. So I may not be able to show you as many tricks as I wanted because my overhead camera's just gone into fisheye. No idea why it's done that. And I might not be able to fix that on the live. All right, so Kate says cutting paper with your sewing scissors gives you flashbacks. These are my paper scissors. So if you have a little look, can you see? They're tagged with craft or paper. Now for my paper scissors, as a pattern cutter, I like to have a long blade, or sometimes I use the length of a dressmaking scissor. So I would never use a smaller blade of scissor than this when I'm pattern making, because I might be doing this for hours and it's really uncomfortable on your hands. So these are in fact paper scissors. Any other questions? Phew, yeah, exactly. You were a bit worried then that I'd lost my marbles. All right, so did you all understand what I did with that basic slash and spread method? Yeah, hope that that made some sense. We may have to just grin and bear this. So for some reason my overhead camera has changed perspective and I don't know how to fix that. So let me just come back onto the main camera. I'm just going to have a look and see why it's turned into fisheye instead of the profile that I had set it to. Don't you love technology? Hang on a sec. So basically I've taken my sleeve like this and I've spread that and I've created a new shape more like the one that I'm wearing, and then I need to make a copy of my new shape. So before you get started, make a copy of the pattern that you want to hack. So if you cut up your original, you can't then go back to the original style without deconstructing everything. So you have your basic pattern, and this could be a block or it could be a tried and true. I would suggest as a home sewer that this would be a tried and true, because then you've worked with it and you know that it fits and it's already got all the stylistic ease and everything in it that you like. If you work with a block, you're going to need to add that ease on before you start hacking. So think about having a tried and true. So it could be like your favourite free pattern from a sewing magazine that you made up and you absolutely love it, but you just want to mix up the sleeve style a little, okay? So before I get started, I would then trim off all of my seam allowance. I've made a copy, then I take off all my seam allowance, and the reason for that is if you start making new style lines, So a style line would be, for example, if I cut it here and made a lower sleeve section, then you have to remember to add the seam allowance on. Now, if you're thinking, oh, I've got seam allowance on the head, I think I've got seam allowance on the underarm, have I got seam allowance? It's just easier to start with a pattern with no seam allowance. So that's how pattern makers work. Okay, so you strip off your seam allowance and then you make your copy and then you play with your copy. And I've got my sleeve, and then I'm happy with this width that I've added in here. I'm then going to take a piece of tracing paper and lay that over the top. Now I like to use pattern weights, and I really love these ones from Foxglove and Field because they look like old-fashioned Silco reels. And they just remind me of sewing with my nan. So once you've got your tracing paper over the top, you're then going to come in, and I'm using a coloured pen just so you can see what I'm doing, but usually I would do this with a pencil. So you're just going to trace out the outline of your pattern, making sure that wherever you've given yourself notches, that you put your notches in here. Okay. And then at the hem edge, if you were to just trace these straight bits, like so, and try and join them, can you see you get a kind of zigzaggy line? It's not a very smooth line. So at your hem, you would come in and you would create a nice smooth curve. You could use a French curve for this, you could just freehand it. So what we want at this lower edge is a smooth curve. And then we come in here, make sure we put our notches back in. And then the last little bit for our hacked pattern that's really important is we need to, and that's why this quilt ruler is quite useful, because I've got that line right down the middle, so I can use that to ensure that I put my grain line back in the same spot in the middle of the pattern. So this is the hacked version, and if I put the original back on, you can see how much wider now this hem is, but although this angle up here looks like it's changed slightly, the actual circumference is still the same. So it's still going to fit into the armhole of the matching bodice. So that's one method of using the slash and spread. And if you look, you can see essentially what I've done is I've added little triangular wedges. So I've slashed and spread out using wedges. Okay, and the next little method that I'm going to show you, we are going to use an overall spread. So we'll be cutting all the way through our pattern pieces. And then just the last little thing for this pattern, I would always come in and use a ruler just to straighten off all these lines, and then I would measure them and make sure that they're still the same length. I haven't made any changes. And if you have stripped off the seam allowance, you then come in and you can use a quilt ruler or a grading ruler and add your seam allowance all the way around the outside. So for a curvy line, the way to add seam allowance is to slide your ruler, keep your pen fixed, and you do this in little increments. So as I start coming around that curve, I'm just sliding the ruler. So I'm focused on this little section because I'm working in half scale. So you would go all the way around the perimeter and add back in all your seam allowance. At the hem, you'd be thinking about what kind of hem allowance you want. If this was just going to be a kind of trumpety sleeve, I might add 2.5 centimeters or an inch. If it was going to be like the example that I'm wearing, I would just add in my regular seam allowance. And then it's kind of important, I would put gathered hem sleeve. So I label my pattern and give yourself a number, version number 1, because you haven't tried this yet. You may trial this and think, oh, I could have done with a bit more, or I could have done with a bit less. And as a pattern maker, I will often come in here and date it. So I'll either number it version 1, version 2, or I will date it, and quite often I do all of them. Okay guys, so the second version, I'm going to imagine that the sleeve I'm wearing has not only got gathering or fullness at the hem, but I also would like some gathering around the sleeve head. So this time I'm going to put my slashes in, and instead of inserting a little wedge, I'm going to slide it all the way across and add volume or width evenly throughout the whole sleeve. So Linda has asked me a great question. Will the change at the top of the sleeve... Okay, so what's happened to the top of the sleeve in that example is it's the same circumference. It's just that the angles have changed slightly. So what's happened is the crown has got a little bit less high, so it's got shorter, but it will be fine. If I was going to put in a massive amount of slashing, it might almost straighten off, and then I may need to think about changing that sleeve head, but I'm just doing a small amount. I'm trying to create a little bit of volume at the hem, so don't worry that it's changed shape slightly. It's still going to fit and it's still going to work, and that's why I would suggest when you hack a pattern that you make up a 12, even if you just make up a 12 for the sleeve bit, just to kind of see how that works. And sometimes if you use tissue paper to trace, you can kind of almost pin that together and try that on and kind of go, oh, I've put masses in, this looks way too voluminous, and you can take some out at the paper stage. All right, so I hope that answers that question, Linda. So the second version, we are, instead of inserting those little wedges, this time when I put my slash lines in, and I'm only going to put 3, this would be the absolute minimum, guys. Okay, so this time when I come to cut these, and you can angle these if you like, they don't have to be absolute straight. I tend to kind of do them straight, but these are all just things to have a little play with. And pattern making is basically like playing with paper shapes, okay? So this time I'm going to cut right through on my slash line. And then I'm going to cut right through, and I'm just, before I do that, sometimes it's helpful to square out some lines so you've got some point of reference when you come back to matching these, and I'll explain that when I get to it, okay? So then cut along here and cut along here. So now that these pieces are all separate, it would be very easy for me to spread them apart and not realize that I've mismatched them. So that's what these little lines are for. So again, if we take a line as our kind of center line, and I'm going to spread this by an even amount. So I've got 2 centimeters there, and then I've got 2 centimeters there. And again, because I'm working with a quilt mat, I can just sort of temporarily stick this in place. And then here is where I would probably make sure that these, I've moved apart evenly, but I want to make sure that they're on a similar line, so I'm not kind of jiggy-jagging it that way. Right, and then I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to spread that. So if you use the lines in the quilt ruler, make sure that your slash lines are perpendicular, not angled like I've done. So here what I could do is come in with my ruler, line up my ruler because I've angled it, and I've put an even amount in there. And let's say I'm going to put almost an inch. And then just make sure that these are still aligned. Like so. And then over here I would do the same thing, so you can bring in your ruler or get a tape measure, just spread this apart. Now I'm going to show you what I mean. It would be very easy if you didn't have these lines to not really understand where this has grown downwards. Can you see how it's grown down? So I would always recommend giving yourself some kind of notches or these squared off horizontal lines, just to make sure everything stays in balance. Okay, so now when we take our tracing paper and again lay this over the top, so I'm just going to come in and very quickly trace the exact outline that I can see. Now, can you see, I'll just draw that little point in here. On the upper circumference, where that's been spread, we've got a point that's sticking up higher than the next section. Now, you're going to have to trim a bit of that point off, okay? So don't worry, you're not really changing the circumference, but what you don't want to do is to join this in like that. So we're looking at creating a smooth line. So from the middle, you kind of follow that and then sort of almost like driving down the road and you're focusing ahead, you're smoothing that in like this. And you can use a French curve or a dressmaker's curve to get nice curves here. So it's just sort of thinking about getting rid of that little corner bit there. And then you can come in and trace off the rest. And again, around the hem, we just want to make sure we've got a nice smooth line, like so. And then again here, you're just smoothing that in like so. And again, make sure that you trace off your notches because these are going to be important for matching back up to your armhole. And I would usually suggest that you put your slash line just slightly higher than a notch because you don't necessarily want to put volume in the underarm area. Make sure you put your shoulder notch back in, and then using that line that you started with down the very middle on your quilt ruler, quilt mat, so your grain line's gone back in there. And again, I would then come in, and this is a full gathered sleeve. Version 1, 29th of June. So again, this now looks very different than the one that we did before. So if you lay them on top of each other, you can see that we've got a lot more width, but the lower edge is only a fraction. So we've completely changed the style of the top and the style of the bottom. All right, guys, hope that all made sense. Hilary has said, does this affect matching the sleeve head notches? I'm keeping my notches true here, and I've slashed just a little bit higher, so those notches are still going to match into your armhole. So let me just show you quickly on here. So can you see here, that's my notch, so this bit will still match my armhole. Where I've placed the slash line is just higher than the notch. If you do slash in here, if you wanted to put it gathered all the way, that would be fine because you'd still match up your notches. I generally don't put a lot of gathering underneath the armpit because it doesn't feel very comfortable. So you can always just measure that notch back in and put a new one if you have slashed below that notch. So just slash slightly higher that notch. So Leslie's just joined. Thanks for joining us, Leslie. Nice to have you here. What I've just showed is pattern hacking. So this isn't about making a bicep adjustment. So a bicep adjustment is a fit adjustment rather than a pattern hack. So a pattern hack is more like pattern cutting. It's creative, and making the bicep wider is more of a fit hack or a fit adjustment. So if you were to do this, it would actually give you a wider bicep, but it's also going to give you a wider circumference, and that is going to change how it fits into your sleeve. So in the example I've just shown you, the sleeve head is now longer in circumference than the armhole, but that's fine because you're going to gather the sleeve head to fit into the armhole. So that's why it's not a bicep adjustment. I hope that makes sense, Leslie. I hope that helps you understand the basics. I just wanted to do these as really quick little stripping right back to the fundamentals. So I'm not going to show you lots of different versions. Essentially, slashing and spreading you can do anywhere. So I could take a bodice like the one that I'm wearing, and can you see that this has got a seam line around about here, and that would have been slashed, removed to make the upper bodice, and then the lower section would have been spread to create the tiers. So you could slash a sleeve here and have the lower section spread, so the upper section doesn't change. So you can use the slash and spread anywhere that you would like to add volume into your tried and true pattern, and it's a great way just to experiment to see what you can do to mix up patterns that you've invested time fitting. I will, in the description on the live, I could put in a little book which is a great reference that you can use for different styles, but I just wanted you to think about what's the basic technique, how do you actually add width or volume or sometimes even length into a pattern by cutting up and spreading apart your original pattern. Hope you found that useful. Thanks for bearing with me with my technology, and I will see you soon. This is going to be a regular. I'm going to be doing one of these little lives at least once, maybe twice a week, and I will let you know about the frequency. But if you've got any suggestions for times that are good, let me know, and I will hopefully see you again soon. Bye.